Okay. Okay, so welcome everyone to our talk with Professor Sarin today. I'm really grateful that he's joined us today. For those of you that don't know, Professor Sarin is a professor at IIM Ahmedabad as part of the Public Systems Group, where he's been studying social policy, and in particular, the one area where Indus Action and Professor Sarin have interacted a lot is his work on RTE 121C and his involvement and leadership of the RTE Resource Center there. So what we're sort of going to talk about today is some parts of the RTE work that Professor Sarin has been involved in, and more, pertinently, some of the COVID-19 relief surveys that he's done, and some of his sort of thoughts on the way that governments, civil society, or even research institutions and private partners have been responding to this crisis. So yeah, we can get started. Thanks so much, Professor Sarin, for joining us. We really look forward to the talk. Yeah, so if you could just start with your, what you've been doing, what you've been working on, and we'll take it from there.
Sure. Thank you, Mahua, and thank you, Indus Action, for hosting me. Indus Action has definitely been an organization that I've admired for quite a while. It's been an organization that I've also learned from quite a bit. When we began the RT work, it was in fact from Indus Action that we were actually learning and acting. So I'm going to try to have more of a conversation. I would rather prefer that. So I will try to keep my thoughts or my sort of initial ideas or provocations limited. And rather than directly speaking about either my RT work or even the household surveys, etc., that we've been doing, maybe I'll get an opportunity to discuss them more as sort of the questions come along. I thought I'd begin with a few provocations. It's a Thursday evening, although which day of the week it is, I don't think many of us now really remember. So let me just instigate or provoke at least some ideas and some discussion. So let me begin, and I should clarify, because I got a shock in some ways when I was listening to the Honorable PM's speech the other day when he started speaking about let's be vocal about local, and I was like, there goes my topic. But I hope the Indus Action folk would sort of back me up when I say that we did suggest this topic before that, before the PM announced it and sort of gave it a flip in terms of what we should local in a global pandemic. But perhaps I don't mean it literally in the sense that the PM spoke about. I don't know. I don't definitely have an insight into his mind. But I definitely don't mean it in the sense of what we have been seeing, at least in the WhatsApp chats, etc. These messages going around saying, "Hey, these are the national brands and these are the global brands." When I mean local, I really mean it more than just sort of a nation for sure. I mean it more in terms of just a geography. I think I mean it more in terms of sort of actual transfer of power. And what that might mean, let me perhaps try to share with you. So I'm going to not have a lot of slides, but just two images I want to begin with. I hope everybody can see these.
Yeah, we can see.
So here is an image from the front pages of a national newspaper, maybe a day or two ago. As you can probably imagine, this is the map of sort of COVID cases across the world. And this has, these different countries colored in 3 colors, or 4 if you include the white. Now, these are images that we've sort of gotten used to seeing. These are the kind of images that we perhaps think we need to generate. And typically they occupy a lot of print space, visual, mind space at least. But as I was looking at this image, I really started wondering, who really is this image useful for? I mean, what exactly is this image telling us that in some ways informs us about any action that we could be taking? And I don't know. Even if we look at just India, seeing whole of India painted in one color, I don't know what that conveys. I mean, you know, so maybe someone who it might be useful for is an alien sitting somewhere in the universe, deciding whether they want to come to the Earth, the planet Earth right now, and then making a call on whether they should or not. But beyond that, I mean, and sure, it gives us some perspective, maybe. But I mean, if I need to go, even if I'm trying to determine where I need to go, where I need to act, where I need to spend money, what I need to do, I really don't get any information from this. And this kind of broad generalization, broad painting, etc., is unfortunately, in my view, what really ends up occupying most of our efforts. We're trying to constantly get this global perspective. We're constantly trying to get sort of, this view from a distance. And I think what the whole COVID crisis in some ways reminds us is that at the end of the day, whilst this might offer some insight, some value, beyond that, it's very difficult to act on it. And, and I'm not talking about this map in particular. I mean, this is just sort of a caricature of the point that I'm trying to make. But I'm also trying to make a point about even if you work, at a country level, I mean, at even a state level or even a district level, the complexities that actually characterize our human life are so local in nature, so granular in nature, that if you actually need to respond to them, you need to get down there. And just as a sort of a counter or a counter example, let me show you another map that was actually made during this COVID crisis, sometime very early on in the lockdown. This map was essentially made by a community leader, a community worker, somebody who works on the ground, Ajaz Sheikh, who is also a PhD student at the Gujarat University. This map depicts where migrant workers from different parts of the country were stuck. And this is just depicting a region which is maybe 3 or 4 wards at best. How this map was created was Ajaz Bhai and his group of friends, volunteers, they knew that these were people who would be in crisis because their owners had left them. They did not have any food available with them. Their sources of food used to be the kelas and the food vendors that had all disappeared from the streets, and they didn't even have kitchen provisions or anything. So Ajaz Bhai and his team went around from literally one small corner to another corner, and this is actually, we've actually zoomed it out so that we protect their privacy. But these were sort of, in some ways, informal, illegal establishments where these workers were stuck. And Ajaz Bhai plotted them out with the help of researchers in the back, noting all of this information. Now, this then led to immediate deliveries of food. This then led to a community, a large aggregation of community kitchens, because each of these clusters were provided groceries, was provided kitchen, cooking utensils, etc. And then they cooked their own food. The point that I'm trying to make is, it is at this level through which action occurred. And how many of us are really working at this level? And that's a question that we have to ask. And I'm assuming most of the folk out there right now are people who are engaged with civil society in some form or the other. So this is a question that civil society needs to ask ourselves. Are we really working at this level, or are we zooming out too much? Who's making the decisions? Are people at a distance making the decisions, or do people on the ground really have the autonomy to make the decisions? Because it's people on the ground who actually made an impact, who created an impact. And without these people who responded immediately, who in some ways, had the local resources, local information also to respond immediately. And most importantly, perhaps, they did not see this as a choice. They saw it as sort of an imperative or duty and obligation, given that they lived right there, and these are people who they were around them. They had the same risks that any of us face in terms of potential of getting infected, taking infections back home. Yet they responded, and it was these people who actually brought relief and brought it immediately to people. And I think we as civil society over the years have marginalized such actors. We've given them less and less autonomy in decision making. We like to work with data, but data that is aggregated, that is zoomed out, and that perhaps loses a lot of information that is actually essential to act. So that's my first, that's really the first point that I wanted to make. I can stop here. I know hearing the same voice is extremely boring. I find that with my own voice. So I'll stop here, Mahua, if there's anything that you want to ask me or anything else that anybody else wants to throw up.
Sure, thanks, Professor Sarin. This is a sort of really great point, especially for people like us at Indus Action who definitely are sometimes guilty of working at a greater scale, maybe not at a district or a community level, and more at a sort of state level. I was kind of wondering about the sustainability of this local action and how, as civil society, as government, and I know that government is not a monolith, it's composed of various parts at various levels of various motivations, can sort of enable more such local action to respond to a crisis that's experienced locally, even though it's conceived of in a very sort of global manner.
Yeah.
So what things can we do to sort of promote more sort of local action or empower more of these local actors?
Yeah, I think, I think one has to really, it's a complex ecosystem under which all of this occurs. And I think what is responsible for this is not just the actions of civil society per se or that of individuals. It's a larger, a way of thinking, a way of trying to understand, and a way of knowing that we have come to value. It is also a question of where power resides. And as you pointed out, in terms of a government not being monolithic. So there are two more elements to this whole picture that I at least would like to point out to. One of them, of course, the question of government, right? We now know, for instance, that when the lockdown was initially announced, perhaps even the chief ministers were not consulted. Fine. But look at the larger structure of governance. You look at the city of Ahmedabad, and this is a point that we tried to make also, that a city of Ahmedabad with a population of 6 million is larger than a number of other European countries, many other countries, and this is just a small. This Ahmedabad is maybe the 7th or 8th largest city in India. It has. You need to give autonomy to your elected representatives at the local level. You need to bring them into decision making. These are people who, again, have knowledge, information, and they have an electorate which is waiting to hold them accountable. But we don't talk about them. And we don't talk about them because we see that most decision making and sort of the purse strings are held by people who are sitting somewhere far away, maybe at the state capital or maybe at the national capital. There is very little engagement that I have seen, and we've been trying to work with elected representatives over the last year, but I have seen very little engagement in terms of civil society and trying to work with these local government leaders. So I think that's one thing that has to change. When you talk about engaging with the government, you completely understand that it's not monolithic. There are tiers to it, and in a way, yes, maybe the returns to acting was in a state capital versus trying to get a ward councillor to understand what you're trying to do and convince him or her or persuade him or her to sort of about something is a more difficult task. But I think that's something that needs to be engaged with.
Sure.
Yeah.
So, yeah, sorry. So one impediment, yes, you sort of mentioned is certainly that perhaps as individuals, civil society actors, we're not engaging with local, say, municipal leaders or perhaps panchayati leaders in a more rural setting. I just wanted to know, what are some of the barriers in your understanding of decentralization? Is it why is it so uneven? Both with respect to funds and functions. And we had, a speaker a few weeks ago who was talking about how successfully it's been done in states like Kerala. What are the barriers that you see overall, but specifically to say Ahmedabad or Gujarat that you were talking about? Why hasn't sort of decentralization worked as well there?
I think nobody likes to give up power. I mean, a parent doesn't like to give up power to a child, and a central authority would never like to give up power to somebody who could potentially compete with them. And I think it's very much a question of power. But I think the related to that as to why that power system doesn't change is also a question of trust. We somehow seem to have trust in very few people, and we somehow want to believe that only a few people are experts and are good people who have the public interest in mind, but others in some ways are just out there to cheat and make money and be corrupt and all of that. And I think that the basic the basic underlying understanding of how things work and the inherent lack of trust, I would really put it at that, is why there is no demand for it. There is a culture which is, in some ways originates in our education system in terms of deference to authority and sort of deference to centralized actors, etc. I mean, I'm of course jumping from a school to a political setting, but I think these are all related, and that's where so I think these are the broad fundamental reasons. Do we have a constitution? I mean, which enables that? Of course, we have one. Do we have states? Do we have examples of states that have done that? Of course, we have. But those states have, in some ways, a much more deeply rooted democratic culture, and which engenders this. We don't now. And should we? Will that be problematic? Yeah, I think there would be setbacks. But even in terms of the COVID crisis, I mean, let me just draw in some other work that we've been doing. We've seen counselors on their own, even though they were not included in the formal response by the government, by the authorities, etc. They were not given information. They had to go around asking for information about what should be, what's the status in the neighborhoods that we live? Where do we send the people that are calling us, asking us for information? Where do we send them? They were proactive on the field. They were trying on the first day onwards. For instance, one of the counselors that we closely worked with, he was out there distributing masks and sanitizers. All the modern, efficient ways of communication that we have were not going to be effective in the places that he needed to reach it out to. So he took out an auto and the old style of taking a loudspeaker and going around trying to make announcements, right? And making announcements saying that, hey, trust the government, listen to what the government is doing. Now, these are people who were acting, out of their own motivations, out of the sense of public committed spirit that they have. Does everybody have it? No, everybody doesn't have it. But that's true across all tiers of the government. But at least these folk can be held accountable to it. So I think, is this going to happen overnight? No, but what I'm saying is, if we as civil society don't see this as a gap and don't try to work on it, I think we are also reinforcing a status quo, a status quo which is, where there's centralized authority, where there's lack of democratic accountability, all of those elements. And I think that's where civil society also needs to reflect.
Yeah, sure. I just wanted to make a quick announcement that, yeah, you can start sort of tweeting your questions and we'll definitely incorporate some of them in the discussion as we move along. So you talked about a lack of trust, which is, I think, a much harder thing to solve for than some, infrastructure or funding or any other mechanism that you would implement in order to have better decentralization. One solution I see, as you pointed out, is certainly for civil society actors, whether they're NGOs, activists, to work with elected representatives and sort of trust them more. How do you see this changing now that we are in this situation of COVID? Do you see that there's an opportunity here to decentralize more? Or do you see that the trend is just to continue centralizing a lot of things and sort of keeping power and actually maybe even consolidating more power, given that we're at a vulnerable moment?
Well, I mean, the PM said we've got to be vocal about local, or, the local is what is important. And so hopefully there is an opportunity. Am I very confident that it's a positive opportunity? Not really. And I think that's because we as citizenry don't have that, faith and belief. But at the same time, I do see some positive steps in that direction. I think, just for instance, at Ahmedabad, the circular that came out when the new team took over, the first thing that they said was we will need to form ward level plans, that we will need to bring in local actors. And I mean, think about it. I mean, this is not an idea that I have. This is an idea from the councillor Shahnawaz Sheikh. I mean, he was saying, look, why are people violating the curfews and why are people coming out? Because they can't get basic stuff. Now, how do you get basic stuff to all houses in, if you've been to any of these congested parts of the city, you'll know these are houses without addresses also, right? They don't, so an outsider can't just come in one day and start delivering food and medicines and what have you to these places. But there are folk who do that. There are, there's the person who goes around collecting electricity bills. There is the postman. There is the person who's perhaps delivering milk in those areas. The councillor knows, where people, the travel history of people who might have come into that, his or her ward. And we have all these resources in place, but none were being used. So I think the fact that, okay, fine, they've recognized that they need to, have these plans at the ward level, at a very decentralized level, maybe use these resources is a positive sign, but from what I've heard, they're still not using the elected representatives yet. Maybe we'll get there one
day. Yeah, I hope so too. It seems like you've had a lot of sort of positive interaction with this councillor that you were talking about. Is this something that happened as a result of the surveys that you had conducted in Ahmedabad with your students? And how receptive have sort of local representatives or any other government machinery that's present there been? How receptive have they been to some of the survey and the findings of the survey that you conducted?
I don't know how receptive anyone's been to the surveys that we've been conducting, because the surveys don't paint a pretty picture.
Right.
The surveys point to the increasing distress that is, I mean, in some ways, we should say, obviously going to be there. What else are you expecting? Mm-hmm. But I think the surveys are pointing out, for instance, in the most recent round that we've done amongst the more vulnerable population, that nearly 85% have lost their income, either completely or, or most of it. Nearly 70%, if I remember the number correctly, have food left for less than 1 week. The number who've actually gotten access to ration is less than 70% as well, even if they had a card. There are, the Jan Dhan Yojana, for instance. Yes, maybe the money might have reached their accounts. But contrary to what the chief economic advisor might believe, that just because people are not withdrawing from those accounts and therefore, the CA believes that there is no distress. I think the reason that people are not withdrawing from the accounts is because they can't withdraw. They can't get to the banks. And or they may not, in some cases, may not even be aware of what's going on. So I think, so the surveys paint picture of distress. I'm not in a position to say to what extent they are actually influencing things. The counselor himself, I think that association actually goes back to the time when we were working with the right to education. And I think, so even before that, I mean, the credit for that goes to Ishu Gupta, who started working with counselors in Aligarh, trying to implement the right to education. And it was his experiment there to try to engage the counselors in in implementing the 25% mandate that led us to also try to reach out to counselors here in Ahmedabad when we were working on the RT, the 25% mandate, section 12(1)(c). And basically what we saw that, what the counselors had the ability to do in a week's time was far greater than what we had the ability to do as an organization trying to do over 2 years in terms of trying to get the message to people, in terms of trying to mobilize, put pressure on the local staff to get this implemented. Now, this counselor, he's a young counselor. He has some very interesting views about education. So in many ways, he truly is exceptional. But at the same time, it's only when we begin working with them, when we share information with them about, many of them are not even aware of what their own roles and responsibilities are and how the institutions work. They work in very informal ad hoc ways. So we've been trying to provide that information to them. We've come out with a lot of, material, I would say at this point, which maps out what they could do, how they could do it, what are the different committees, what are the different budgets, how is a budget written. Each counselor has to their disposal 25 lakh rupees on an annual basis. Not a lot of money, but if you have 4 counselors in a ward, that's 1 crore, and which they spend. And now can you work to influence that and work with them to perhaps get it to people that their constituency might value. So I think this relationship with the counselor predates this particular COVID crisis and the surveys that we've been doing.
Understood. So I think, I think you're absolutely right in saying that there's been a lot of what's not
Mahua, I can't hear you.
Of each of these stakeholders really is. You might have multiple NGOs serving constituency and neighborhood, and there might be sort of a gap or a lacuna elsewhere. Some of the things that you mentioned, obviously putting out map or putting out a data, doing really localized surveys of your neighborhood would aid the councillor or local elected leader in making better decisions about how to spend that money and how to coordinate. Are there any other sort of good practices or other solutions that you think of that can help coordinate a lot of this local action, some of it which is sort of directed through really centralized channels, right? Like the distribution may happen at a local level.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, sort of coming from the center, directed by the state. So yeah, just wondering if you had any thoughts on that. And then we also have a similar related question, which I can get into and feel free if this question that I just asked was big enough, and then I won't. But the other question was about the fact that technology platforms tend to centralize in spite of claiming to decentralize interactions and decision-making. Are there any technologies or functions worth centralizing by design? For instance, vaccination discovery and manufacturing. So this was a question that we got from Twitter. I don't know if in your head if they're related, but in my head they were. So feel free to answer them separately or together.
Of course, I mean, I don't want to in any way, look, even the Corona crisis, I mean, or what we are experiencing today. I mean, the reality is that it's a small, nano-sized, I don't know how big or small that is, like a virus which is causing all this havoc. Uh, but we recognize it today because it's acting globally. And we may not have recognized it if it had not acted globally. So of course, I mean, there are both these sides to these things. So do you need central authority? Do you need coordination? Do you need some places where you do take out, you zoom out and you try to get a perspective or you make decisions? Of course you do. But then there has to be, R&D, generalized knowledge, of course, has its role, especially knowledge which sort of, can spill over, which doesn't need, I mean, if it's some knowledge which is not very context specific in order for it to create value, right? Of course, there is, that's the place where central actors can act and should act. Places where there are very strong spillovers from one locality to another, and you need people to coordinate and ensure that these externalities in some ways are limited, there you need the government to act. But the government, I mean, the central authorities in other places should lay down certain principles and values, or basic guidelines. The operations will in any way be dependent on what happens locally. We can prescribe as much as we want, but at the end of the day, it's the person who's sitting on the ground, the government functionary, whether he be a group class A officer or a class D or whatever it is, they interpret and they act on their, what they believe to be right and how they understand the law and how they want to, or how they see the person who may benefit or be hurt by the law. So in any case, that action always happens. And I think, we need to recognize that. And we need to therefore give that autonomy to people. So I'm not trying to say, hey, let's all be autonomous units with no, constraints, no sort of centralized guidelines, etc. I'm not arguing that, but I think we are right now in a place where the balance is very strongly tilted away from recognizing the local and much more towards sort of these larger, big picture things. Did I answer your question or did I veer away to something else?
No. You definitely answered the second question. I actually did a bad job of throwing a lot of things at you. I think one part of the question that we can sort of think through, and it has been asked mostly in relation to education, but generally I was wondering, what are best practices that we can follow to coordinate better? So one thing is definitely reach out to your local MLA, create knowledge, whether that's in the form of mapping or surveys or anything else to help them make better decisions and optimize the limited funds or resources that they have. Are there sort of any other things that we can do, perhaps forming local NGO coalitions and divvying up the work that we have to do? Or like, what are some of the ways that you're seeing this emerge and what would help?
See, from what I've heard of people who have been in some ways working in the sector much longer, that whenever a disaster or crisis of this nature has struck, and wespecially from what I hear in terms of Gujarat, the government has been quick to sort of form, coordinating agency or nodal authority who will coordinate with civil society, and there will be some degree of coordination that occurs with the government and civil society in this form. And there are sort of, some clear guidelines that are laid out as to how civil society can work with the government and how the government will, they will work in collaboration. From what I am aware of, I haven't yet seen that being announced yet, at least not in Gujarat. I think maybe in Jharkhand, for instance, they have announced one, they've designated one NGO, one organization as sort of the nodal partner. And so there's that level of coordination. I think, yes, working across civil society organizations, working as collectives is essential. And let me, I mean, sorry, this is going to sound a little bit like a rant, but let me go ahead and say this. Something that, bothers me a lot these days is when I see organizations put out numbers in terms of how many people they've helped and how many people they've fed. And I see organizations sitting in one corner of the country saying that we've, fed, I don't know what, 3 lakh, 4 lakh people. Now, surely you've not done it on your own. You might have paid a part, and I think that's great. But you could not have done it alone. And, if every organization starts claiming, making such claims, I mean, we're engaging in double counting to, I don't know how many times. And that destroys the credibility of civil society as well. And I think at this point, such claims don't need to be made. This is not the time to be making such claims. Let's try to keep these aside for the time being. Let's say, hey, we are working together as collectives. And I think, of course, the organizations also work in a certain system where, funders are looking at these numbers and they are trying to be swayed by them and all of that. And I think, so that's why I'm saying this is not just a question of one actor changing what they do or not do. It's a larger ecosystem. It's a larger way of how we look at things, and which in some ways incentivizes or sort of, it becomes a part of routine to put out numbers such as this, which at some level don't have any meaning. But because it's a ritual that needs to be done, we become as ritualized as other people that we might criticize. So I think that's, so yes, we do need to form collectives, but let's have genuine collectives, let's have genuine partnerships, and let's keep certain things aside for the time being. Yeah.
Thanks for that. It wasn't really a rant, but that's absolutely true. I think we've at least found that a lot of organizations might be reluctant to join a collective because you can't sort of then claim an individual impact as an organization. So that's definitely true. And that trust deficit, I guess, is there between government, within government, between civil society organizations, and vice versa. So that's absolutely spot on. So related to this, I think somebody had asked on the form is, what role can local governments play in dispensing financial support measures? Whether at all there exists any real role for them, given the focus on JAM. I'm sorry, I'm not quite sure about that. And they said that there are cases of increase in arbitrary state power and its abuse in this time. So how do you sort of view whether local governments can play a role in giving out support, or some of the funding can be sort of devolved in that manner?
I think, at this, one should not lurch from one institutional system to another. So even as I'm sort of in some ways advocating for greater involvement, I wouldn't say that, hey, make the local authorities or the urban councillors, for instance, be decision makers. I mean, that's exclusive decision makers. I think there needs to be coordination. There needs to be sort of, I mean, there's a lot of announcements, for instance, that are being made today and yesterday, for instance, about giving, loans of different sizes to street vendors, to small, medium enterprises. I mean, today there was something about street vendors. I quickly saw it before I joined in here. So a lot of this information does rest with these councillors, etc. Form small committees which include them. Let there be some tensions in that committee. Let there be people who perhaps are speaking for, from different perspectives. And I think that's definitely, I think they definitely should have a role. Because at the end of the day, the bureaucracy is the accountability runs upwards. For a councillor, it should. I'm not saying that in practice it necessarily does, but at least there are some institutional mechanisms which make the accountability run downwards. They do need to go back to the electorate and, get elected, re-elected or whatever again. So let's use that system of accountability in that. And I think there definitely needs to be a greater role that has to be provided to them.
Thank you. Thanks for answering that. So we have a few questions on chat. I'm going to just try to organize them by topic as much as I can. So one question that we had is, what do you see as second and third order effects on nutrition and learning outcomes of children during this crisis? And related to that was, is there a more accessible or feasible alternative to sort of digital for engaging students? What are some of the immediate steps that organizations can take to address gaps in access to education? And if you can talk about sort of gender gaps as well, that would be helpful. I'll pause here.
Okay. I'm definitely not an expert on everything. And I will be, I guess, treat me as treat this as any other conversation you might have. Please don't treat this as sort of somebody with a lot of expertise sitting and answering these questions. I think the issue of gender gaps, I think the issue of gender violence, before even coming to gender gaps in education and learning, I think that issue is something which is terribly still hidden. I know a lot of organizations have been trying to voice it and bring it out, but I think it's our structures don't allow that to be expressed very widely. So that's definitely huge. In terms of nutrition and education, I think one of the things that we are repeatedly finding in our surveys, for instance, parents tell us that they don't have any money for milk. The children have also gotten fed up with just the same things that are being what they have for. There are many cases where they're just eating rice and water. And most, despite whatever the government pronouncements might have been, for instance, Anganwadis have definitely stopped running, and the hot meals that were used to be given to children between 3 to 6 have not been provided. There have been some substitutes with providing THRs, and I'm again, what I'm sharing is more about Gujarat and Ahmedabad, and may not even generalize beyond Ahmedabad. So let me make that very clear. I know places like Kerala, etc., have been much more proactive, and the Supreme Court, in fact, itself has sort of also said that meals need to be reaching the households, and that's not reaching, at least not here. So I think nutrition is taken a very big hit, definitely, and that's why we are, in some ways, we are trying to work on a proposal which sort of says, which extends the Doodh Sanjeevani scheme here in Gujarat to other places in the state, to all children, at least for a period of 3 months, where you provide free milk to children, or at least subsidize it heavily. So I think that needs immediate attention. Education, I'll be very honest, I think, the fact that we ourselves have relegated education, and we've asked questions about how children, whether children are getting nutrition, the sort of the midday meals, etc. But we have not asked questions about education, and I think it's a reflection of how education is going to be deprioritized. I'm honestly not very hopeful of Section 12(1)(c) really being holding on. You have private hospitals in Ahmedabad, for instance. I was reading a report today which says that private hospitals are still refusing to come on board as far as responding to COVID. Now, if you can have that in this crisis, when private actors can refuse to open up the hospitals for something like a crisis that we are facing today, an emergency crisis like that we are facing today, I see very little chance that private schools will cooperate on 12(1)(c). And I think it's a time that is a good reminder for us about why many of us have been making an argument that, some health, education, these are things that you can't just leave to private hands, and why the need to have public systems, etc., in place are absolutely essential. So now, in terms of alternatives to digital, I think we need to find them. We need to find how do you get worksheets to children, and maybe it's the postman who can take these worksheets to children and pick them up. We need to find, can we distribute workbooks, collect them, because children, digital, my children, I've seen this sort of with my own children, despite the best technology and best of infrastructure, it doesn't work beyond an hour or two and keeping them engaged. And I don't think digital is the solution for, even with infrastructure. And then, you account for the fact that even if people have phones at home, the amount of time that children or women would actually get on the phone. I think we have to think of these other ways. I believe organizations like Pratham, etc., have been doing that. I need to find out more, but I think though we should definitely not be get onto this digital bandwagon. That I'm convinced about.
Got it. I was wondering if you could, I mean, I don't know if you have a sense of, predicting, maybe when schools will open, what the maybe public education system is really going to do in the absence of, say, digital. I mean, forget RT 12(1)C for now, but just in general, how do you see it emerging? Schools sort of opening on time, doing one class a week, or one in-school day a week, and then the rest of it is at home. So what are some strategies that you can predict or recommend from your experience?
I can't predict anything.
Okay.
I mean, I think, so I believe over here schools aren't even attempting to open before September.
Right.
And, we will need to think of creative ways. I mean, maybe children go to school there's some rotation. There's some rotation. Maybe we need to rethink pedagogy in some ways. How do we give children exercises and work to do, which is perhaps more tuned to their home environment? How do we customize their learning, which can actually build off their home environment? And I think that's an opportunity for civil society to contribute to. How do you come up with material which works for children in small rooms, but they might still have, certain kinds of material in place? How do you teach them concepts through that? How do you give them exercises which they can work using the material, using information that they might have? And then, using the digital as a means of sort of communication and getting things clarified. But I think that's a space that civil society, that's the innovation that civil society should be working on, not more apps and not more technology-based solutions. I think the basic technology solutions to do whatever we want to do already are probably there. The rest of it is, a little bit of branding and differentiation.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just want to tell everyone that there are some questions on chat, and feel free to add to it. So related, I'm just going to throw all the education questions at you right now, and then switch back to the local governance questions. I hope that sort of works logically in everybody's head. One question is, many people fail to understand government advisories and schemes or welfare delivery due to illiteracy and technicalities. What's the best way to disseminate IEC material to every citizen in a district? And perhaps a follow-up to that, like who can help in driving that?
Yeah, but this is exactly why I'm saying we need to get the elected folk there. Who are the people who communicated to them, who managed to convince them to vote for them? Right? It's the elected folk. They know how to connect. They know how to communicate. Yes, there is a question of literacy, and there is, there are those barriers absolutely there. But there are folk who make a living out of communicating to these people and persuading them constantly. This is the time you bring them into this larger public interest that sort of, is upon us. And I think learn from them. Surely they've been doing this, right? And they've been doing something right. So instead of necessarily, again, looking for experts sitting in management institutions, etc., saying, come up with communication strategies,
right.
Look down. There are folk who do this for their living. They'll do it, get ideas from them.
That's a great point. And sort of related to that, I think Lakshit was asking, to do we need to actually go deeper with how we're decentralizing? I think he specifically asked, do you believe that we need smaller units in the wards and more functionaries with defined power to improve decentralization? And he's saying that today, perhaps one of the reasons for decentralization not working is that elected representatives simply have a huge area to cater to. I think he's mostly referring to sort of urban areas where they have a huge population perhaps to cater to. May not be as local as Punjab.
I agree. We do need to go deeper, but we haven't even reached here yet. And maybe the question of size. I mean, Ahmedabad has 48 wards, and these wards have populations which are at least 40, 50,000 at least, more than that. And each ward has 4 councillors. Now, there are other elements within, for instance, under JNN, URM, etc. There were supposed to be area sabhas that would have to be formed. There is a ward committee, that is supposed to meet. The ward committee in places like Karnataka, for instance, includes representatives of civil society also, not here. But there are those institutional structures that are there, which are supposed to democratize and, decision making and get more people involved. The point is they haven't received much attention. And it's not surprising that they've been relegated and they've been just, so I agree, even at the ward level, we have, we are probably still more centralized than we would like to be. But right now, the only centralization we seem to think about is, if the municipal commissioner is out there making decisions. And that's not the extent to which we need to decentralize. The municipal commissioner has a very significant role to play. I'm not, decrying that the role that a commissioner has today. But even the most capable municipal commissioner, can he or she be governing a city of 6 million people with the diversity, heterogeneity that, for instance, Ahmedabad and most big cities have? And I think, I think that's impossible for any person, despite their best capabilities and best motivations.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know, maybe we need to sort of get in touch with or work with other organizations that are looking at building this capacity ground up for local representatives, or trying to make governance a bit more heterarchical and not so hierarchical. Getting back to some of the questions that are coming up on chat, Asta had asked if you think there's a possibility of overburdening government schools, given that parents might withdraw students from low-income private schools due to their fall in income or due to maybe reimbursements coming in late. If yes, is there a way to prepare the system better to deal with this influx? Or do you think that education is not going to be a priority at all for poorer communities right now?
I can't see education not being a priority for poorer communities. I think one thing that we have learned, and I'm sure Indus Action knows this even better than I do, the issue of parents believing in schooling and schooling as a means for upward mobility is fairly deep now. And I think despite everything, parents would be anxious to get their children into schools and making sure that they have the schooling that they were hoping for. I think, I hadn't thought about this and I thank, I think you said Asta for raising this issue.
Yes.
See, the truth also is that many in cities, because many of the municipal schools were actually working with low capacity, and because children had exited out to private schools. And so if you look at the per child expenditure that was happening in government schools, that was fairly big, just because if the total budget by the number of children, right? And if you also looked, and so there was all these things about school rationalization, mergers happening. And maybe that would hopefully be one response, that, we stop this drive towards closing down government schools, turning out the infrastructure, using it for other purposes, etc. And I think this is something that should definitely, we should be on the lookout for, and trying to make sure that the government responds anticipating this, because I do think the issue that's being raised is a fairly likely event to occur.
Right. And I mean, in relation to this, and although I feel like you've really, to some degree, already answered this, is Siddharth's question where he's saying one of the biggest opportunities at present is building public good systems, education and healthcare in particular. And while the state may not consider this to be a priority, especially when we're firefighting a crisis like this, how can we as civil society push this agenda at a local level to ensure we're better equipped? Yeah, that's a broad question, but yeah, feel free to answer it however you want to.
I think this is where organizations like Indus Action, which have tried to work with government programs and schemes and try to engage with the government on strengthening their the delivery and the implementation of their schemes. I think this is where organizations like Indus Action step in and should be valued, because we've gotten used to civil society in some ways operating very independently of government and running parallel tracks and parallel programs, etc. There are reasons, for that, but I think the need to greater engage with the public systems is very apparent. Of course, organizations will also have to navigate a very tricky path in terms of, when you start working with the government, how do you make sure that you have your own voice and you can hold them accountable, because the power equations are so skewed. And I think that's where, having organizations will have to be courageous. And what can add to the courage is if funders, give them in some ways, so for instance, I love the way some funders work, that they say, hey, this is money that we've delegated to an organization, and now we aren't controlling the organization. So the organization itself has the resources to take on a fight if it needs to. And the funder doesn't necessarily need to be held in some way saying, hey, why you, what agenda are you pursuing? And I think those are systems which funders need to think about, and civil society needs to work with them. And I think because the issue, a constructive challenge to government, a constructive engagement with the government in terms of, the way it's delivering its programs and schemes is essential. It's healthy. And I think we need to have that kind of a healthy relationship between civil society and government. And I think there needs to be more engagement for sure.
Right. So we are running short on time, I think, but I'm still going to go ahead and ask one or two questions. I hope you don't mind if we extend by 5 to 6 more minutes.
I'm good.
Okay, great. So, I mean, in relation to what you're saying about having a constructive relationship with government, what are some of the key elements, say, if we're doing advocacy, we have research available to us. What are some things that make some of the insights that we have more actionable by the state? Is it the depth of the knowledge that you have? Is it some suggestions that perhaps help them rationalize their own sort of budgets? How do you kind of get executive and political buy-in for some of the recommendations that we're making to government? As you so rightly pointed, because it's an asymmetric relationship and they have their own priorities. And related to that, I think Mayuthar had asked, what are some of the barriers for not universalizing a lot of welfare schemes by the state? So, for example, the Pradhan Mantri Matru-Vandana Yojana still requires mums and pregnant and nursing mothers to fulfill certain conditions to get 5,000 rupees. Why is the inclusion or exclusion error really a concern during this crisis, given that you already have a vehicle for delivering welfare to a vulnerable population? What are some of the ways in which we can impress upon the government what they should act on some of these suggestions that we have?
Yeah, the question of universalization, people like John Rez, etc., have pointed this out, fairly long time ago, saying why universalization just makes a whole lot more sense than trying to do this targeting and stuff. You do a cost benefit analysis and all of that also from that perspective. Keep aside the equity reasons and the reasons for social justice. Even from that perspective, it makes the Narega is a good example of how you can have actually a universally scheme, which is, where everybody's eligible, everybody in the rural area is eligible, and it's just sort of voluntary participation, right? So why that doesn't, what is the barrier? I don't know. I think some of it is, I think, a fetish by some economists to think that they can get it right, and they can optimize, and I think that that's part of it. I think part of it is, in not universalizing, the state always retains some power to withhold, greater power to withhold, and sort of, you can always find reasons why some person may not get what he or she should be entitled to. I think there's a sort of a larger political economy question there. Sorry, but that was the second part of what you asked me. The first part was...
The first part was, what are key elements in advocacy that we do with government, whether that's research, that makes it more actionable by them, or more sort of likely for them to take it up and pursue it, whether that's depth of a problem that we've studied, or whether that's, like you were talking about, it is a political economy question, like whether it's for them more politically feasible, or what are some of the ways in which we can strengthen advocacy?
I don't know. I mean, my own ignorance limits me from answering that question, but at one level, I just don't know how government actors make decisions. I don't know if anybody really does, and what is driving them and what is not driving them. So it's difficult. So since you can't get into their mind, I think it's important for organizations to have their own compass and their own very clear. What is it? Why are you doing research of a particular kind? What is it that you want? And just keep working at that, because there is a lot of research which is actually rhetoric. And I think organizations need to be careful in not, being subsumed in that. And so therefore, I think, organizations need to know have their own priorities straight. And one thing that I would always encourage organizations to do, and not everybody is necessarily able to do this, not necessarily us also all the time, but try to say that whatever we do, we will share publicly. This is not just for your own in-house consumption. This needs to go out. We are a civil society organization. We, our accountability is to the larger civil society. This information has to go out. And so try to negotiate that. Yeah.
Sure. On that note, this talk and discussion will certainly be going out on our social media channels. I'm going to sort of conclude, and thank you so much, Professor Sarin, for being with us so long on this call, and for everybody else who sort of attended on first day. Just wanted to say that it'll definitely be going out soon. And if you have any other questions or information that you'd like to share, do write to us at info@indusaction.org. I think somebody in Indus Action is saying making knowledge as a public good is a worthwhile pursuit. Thank you for reminding us that philosophical openness value again. I suspect that's Tarun, but yeah. Thank you so much, Professor Sarin.
All right, thank you. Thank you for having me. Bye.
Okay,
Bye.
Thanks everyone. Okay.